On the 5th of October 2011, one of the most powerful companies on Earth went completely silent. In Apple stores across the world, employees stopped what they were doing. Customers standing at display tables put down the devices they were holding. Some people cried. Some stood perfectly still, staring at nothing. Some walked out onto the street and looked up at the sky as if searching for something they could not name. Steve Jobs was dead. He was 56 years old. He had fought pancreatic cancer for 8 years with the same ferocious refusal to accept what the world told him was inevitable, that had defined every single day of his extraordinary life. And when his body finally gave out, his sister, Mona Simpson, sat beside him and later described what she had witnessed. She said that in his final hours, Steve Jobs looked at his children for a long time. Then he looked past them. Then he said 3 words, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." And then he was gone. The world mourned him the way it mourns very few people, not just as a businessman or a technologist, but as something rare and harder to define. A person who had looked at the ordinary world and refused to accept that ordinary was enough. A person who had believed with such absolute and irrational conviction that beauty and technology and human experience could be woven together into something that changed how people felt about being alive, that he had actually made it happen. But the story that produced that man, the story that forged Steve Jobs into the person who could build Apple and lose Apple and come back from the edge of personal and professional destruction to build it again into the most valuable company on Earth, that story begins not in a garage in Silicon Valley, but in a hospital room in San Francisco where a young woman made the most painful decision of her life. And the boy she gave away never forgot it. Joanne Schiebel was a 23-year-old graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in 1954 when she fell in love with a Syrian Muslim man named Abdul Fattah Jandali. Joanne was Catholic. Her father was dying and had made it clear that his blessing would never be given to a relationship with a man who was not of their faith. She became pregnant. And in a time and a culture where unmarried pregnancy carried a weight of shame almost impossible to fully comprehend today, she made the decision that she could not keep the child. She traveled to San Francisco and gave birth on February 24th, 1955, to a boy she named and then surrendered. She had one condition. The child had to be adopted by college graduates. The couple originally chosen to receive him backed out at the last moment because they wanted a girl. And so the baby ended up with Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple in Mountain View, California, who had not gone to college, but who wanted a child with a love so deep and so fierce that Joanne Schiebel eventually signed the adoption papers anyway after extracting one promise from them. They promised to send him to college. They named him Stephen Paul Jobs. Paul Jobs was a machinist who worked with his hands and took enormous pride in the craft of making things properly. He had a workshop in the garage, and he brought his son into it from the time Steve was small, showing him how things were built, teaching him that the quality of work was not just about what could be seen from the outside, but about what was done in the hidden places, the back of the cabinet, the underside of the drawer that no customer would ever look at. Steve Jobs absorbed that lesson so completely that decades later, he would insist that the inside of Apple computers be as beautifully designed as the outside, even though no user would ever see it, because the craftsman knew, and the craftsman standard was the only standard that mattered. But the knowledge that he had been given up, that somewhere in the world there were 2 people who had looked at him and decided they could not keep him, sat inside Steve Jobs like a splinter he could never fully remove. He learned about his adoption when he was around 7 years old. He later described sitting in the front yard of their house, processing what his parents had told him, and looking up to see them watching him from the window with expressions of concern on their faces. He told them not to worry. He told them he understood, but he never fully did. And the wound of abandonment, the irrational but irresistible feeling of having been found not worth keeping, drove him toward a hunger for significance that no amount of success ever fully satisfied. At school in Cupertino, Steve Jobs was immediately and obviously different. He was intellectually ferocious and completely indifferent to authority. He refused to do things he found pointless, regardless of who was asking. He was the kind of student who made teachers simultaneously fascinated and exhausted, too smart to ignore, too difficult to contain. He found his people in the engineering culture of Silicon Valley that surrounded him. The fathers of his friends worked at technology companies. Electronics were everywhere, and when a neighbor showed him his first electronics kit, a collection of components that could be assembled into working devices, something in Steve Jobs ignited that never went out. He met Steve Wozniak through a mutual friend when Jobs was 13 and Wozniak was 18. Wozniak was the most gifted electronics engineer Jobs had ever encountered, a genuine prodigy who could design circuits of breathtaking elegance and efficiency. Jobs was not an engineer in the same technical sense. What he was something rarer, a person who could look at what engineers built and understand intuitively how it could be made meaningful to ordinary human beings. They complemented each other perfectly. Wozniak built things of extraordinary technical sophistication. Jobs understood how to make those things matter to people who did not understand the technology and did not need to. The partnership that would eventually produce Apple was forming, but first came Reed College. His parents had made a promise to Joanne Schiebel, and they kept it. They sent Steve to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, one of the most academically demanding liberal arts colleges in America. It cost more than they could afford. His father had saved for years. His mother worked extra shifts. They gave everything they had to fulfill the promise they had made. Steve Jobs dropped out after 6 months, not because he was failing, not because he was unhappy, but because he could not bear the idea that his parents were spending money they did not have on required courses that felt useless to him. He felt the guilt of their sacrifice too acutely to continue taking it. But dropping out turned into something unexpected and transformative. He told the college he was leaving, but asked if he could continue attending classes, unofficially sleeping on floors in dorms, eating free meals at the local Hare Krishna temple, auditing whatever classes interested him without obligation or credit. The college said yes, and freed from the requirement to take classes that meant nothing to him, he followed his curiosity wherever it led. He wandered into a calligraphy class being taught by a professor who was passionate about the art of letter forms, the design of typefaces, the spacing of letters, the visual beauty of written language as a craft. It seemed utterly impractical. It had no obvious application to anything he was planning to do with his life. 10 years later, when he was designing the Macintosh computer, he pulled everything he had absorbed in that calligraphy class into the typographic system of the Mac, making it the first personal computer in history to feature multiple typefaces and proportionally spaced fonts. The beauty of the written word built into the machine at its most fundamental level. If he had not dropped out and wandered into that calligraphy class on a whim, the entire visual language of personal computing might have been different. He returned to California and moved back into his parents' house in Los Altos. He slept on the floor. He ate very little. He walked 7 miles every Sunday to the Hare Krishna temple for a free meal. And in the evenings, he went to the garage where Steve Wozniak was working on something extraordinary. Wozniak had designed a personal computer, a machine of remarkable elegance built around the new microprocessors that had just become available. It was called the Apple I. Jobs looked at it and immediately saw what Wozniak could not quite see from inside the engineering. He saw a product, not a hobbyist kit, not a technical curiosity for enthusiasts. A product, something that could be sold to ordinary people, something that could change how people related to technology forever. He convinced Wozniak to go into business with him. They founded Apple Computer on April 1st, 1976 in the Jobs family garage. Jobs was 21 years old. They built the first computers by hand, Wozniak designing the circuits, and Jobs managing production with a focus on quality and elegance that the technology world had never seen before. The Apple II launched in 1977 and was a phenomenon. It was not just a computer, it was designed, packaged, and presented as a beautiful object. Jobs had insisted on a molded plastic case instead of the metal boxes that every other personal computer came in. He had insisted on a keyboard that felt right. He had insisted on a power supply that ran silently instead of the noisy fans that everyone else used. He had insisted that the experience of owning and using the machine had to feel as good as the machine itself performed. By 1980, Apple Computer was worth $1.2 billion on its first day of public trading, the most successful IPO in Silicon Valley history up to that point. Steve Jobs, at 25 years old, was worth over $200 million, and then he hired the man who would destroy him. John Sculley was the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, a brilliant marketing executive who had built Pepsi into a genuine rival to Coca-Cola. Jobs recruited him to Apple in 1983 with a question that has become one of the most famous lines in business history. He asked Sculley if he wanted to spend the rest of his life selling sugared water, or if he wanted to come and change the world. Sculley came to Apple. The relationship started well, but deteriorated as Jobs became increasingly difficult to work with. He was brilliant, but he was also tyrannical. He had no patience for people who could not keep up with his vision. He was capable of extraordinary cruelty to colleagues who disappointed him and extraordinary devotion to those who met his impossible standards. He created a reality distortion field around him, a force of personality so powerful that people in his presence genuinely began to believe that the impossible was achievable. But the board of directors was watching the chaos and making calculations. In 1985, they sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs was removed from his operational role at Apple. He tried to organize a counter-strategy, and when it failed, he was effectively pushed out of the company he had founded. He was 30 years old. He had just been thrown out of his own creation. He later said it was the most devastating experience of his life, that he genuinely did not know for a period of time what to do or who he was outside of Apple, that the company had been so completely the expression of his identity that losing it felt like losing himself. He bought a grand piano. He took a long trip through Europe. He thought about becoming a physicist. He thought about running for Senate. He sat with the wreckage of what felt like a complete and total failure and tried to figure out what came next. And then he started building again. He founded a new computer company called Next, targeting the higher education market with machines of extraordinary power and beauty. The computers were too expensive for the market he was targeting, and Next never achieved commercial success. But the software platform he built at Next was years ahead of everything else in existence. Then, in 1986, he bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas for $5 million and invested $50 million of his own money into it. That company was Pixar. Nobody believed Pixar was going to be anything significant. It was a hardware company that made expensive graphics computers for technical applications. Jobs lost money on it for years. He came close to selling it multiple times. Then Pixar made a deal with Disney to produce a computer animated feature film. The film was called Toy Story. It was released in November 1995 and became the highest-grossing film of the year. When Pixar went public shortly after the release of Toy Story, Steve Jobs' stake in the company was worth $1.5 billion. He had become a billionaire from the company everyone had told him was a distraction from his real work. And then Apple came calling. By 1996, Apple was in crisis. The company that had once defined personal computing was floundering. Its products were unfocused. Its software was behind. Its market share was collapsing. It was losing hundreds of millions of dollars every quarter, and the board was running out of options. Apple acquired Next for $429 million, primarily to get the Next operating system as the foundation for a new Apple platform. But what they were really buying, though some of them did not fully realize it yet, was Steve Jobs. He returned to Apple in 1997 as an advisor. Within months, he was the interim CEO. The board had given him back the company he had built and lost 12 years earlier. He walked into Apple and did the thing that only a person with absolute clarity of vision and absolute disregard for conventional wisdom could do. He cut. Apple had dozens of products in development, dozens of projects consuming resources and attention and energy. Jobs looked at all of them and reduced the entire product lineup to four products: a professional desktop, a consumer desktop, a professional laptop, a consumer laptop. Everything else was canceled. The people whose projects were canceled were devastated. The industry analysts thought he had lost his mind. Cutting products when a company was struggling seemed like exactly the wrong strategy. It was exactly the right strategy. With the company's resources focused on 4 products instead of dozens, the quality of each one became extraordinary. The iMac launched in 1998, a computer in a translucent, colored plastic case that looked unlike anything that had ever existed in the technology industry. It sold 350,000 units in its first 6 weeks. Then came the iPod in 2001, then iTunes. Then the iTunes Store, which changed the entire music industry overnight. Then the MacBook. Then, in January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and told the audience he was going to show them 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. He let the audience cheer each one separately. Then he told them it was not 3 products. It was 1 product. He held up the iPhone. In the 2 years after the iPhone launched, Apple's stock price tripled. The smartphone industry, which had been dominated by BlackBerry and Nokia, was transformed overnight. Every phone made before the iPhone suddenly looked like a relic. Every phone made after it was trying to catch up to what Apple had created. Then came the App Store, then the iPad, then the MacBook Air, then Apple retail stores that became the highest revenue per square foot retail locations in the world, then iCloud. Then an ecosystem of products and services so deeply integrated into the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people that leaving it felt almost physically disorienting. In August 2011, Apple became the most valuable company on earth, surpassing ExxonMobil. 2 months later, Steve Jobs was dead. He had known for months that the end was coming. He had kept working until he physically could not. He had approved products that would launch after he was gone. He had built a team and a culture and a set of values so deeply embedded in the organization that the company he left behind was capable of continuing to create extraordinary things without him. He died worth approximately $10.2 billion from a boy sleeping on floors and walking 7 miles for a free meal, from a garage in Los Altos with a friend and a dream and a standard of quality that refused to accept anything less than beautiful. From the most devastating professional failure imaginable, being thrown out of your own creation at 30 years old and finding a way to come back and build something 10 times greater than what had been taken from you. But here is what I need you to understand before this video ends. Steve Jobs was not great because he was a genius. Wozniak was the engineering genius. Jobs was something different, a person who cared so unreasonably, so irrationally, so completely about the quality of what he made and the experience it created for the person using it that he was willing to fight anyone and destroy any relationship and delay any deadline to get it right. He once said that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. He was not speaking theoretically. He was speaking from the specific lived, painful experience of a boy who had been given away, who had dropped out, who had been thrown out of his own company, who had failed commercially with Next, who had spent years losing money on a graphics company nobody believed in, and who had used every single one of those experiences as fuel for a fire that eventually burned bright enough to be seen from space. The question this story leaves you with is not about Steve Jobs. It is about the standard you hold yourself to. Not the standard other people set for you, not the standard that is comfortable or achievable or reasonable, the standard that keeps you awake at night because you know the thing you made is not yet what it could be, the standard that makes people around you exhausted and frustrated and occasionally furious because you refuse to accept good enough when extraordinary is possible. That standard is available to you right now, today, not after you have more resources, not after you have more time, not after the circumstances are more favorable, now. Because if a boy who was given away at birth, who slept on floors, who was thrown out of his own company at 30, who spent years building things that failed, if that boy could build the most valuable company in the history of human enterprise, then the only thing standing between you and your own version of that story is the standard you decide to hold yourself to starting today. If this story lit something inside you, if it reminded you that your rejection is not your ending, and that being thrown out of one chapter might be the very thing that prepares you for the greatest chapter of your life, then subscribe to Billionaire Blueprint right now. Every single week we bring you the untold stories of the men and women who started with nothing, survived everything, and built empires that changed the world forever. These are not motivational fairy tales. These are blueprints. Real people, real pain, real decisions that changed the entire direction of their lives. Subscribe, stay with us, and let us build something extraordinary together.